How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Elvier Gonzalez here. And today, well, let's continue to explore about the not so secret life cycle of variables, or in other words, is to understand now how these certain declarations, aka variables, functions, and lexical declaration like let and cons behave because so far we have understand how scope works, the behavior of scope, and how now a scope is created. So whether it's a function or a block, and per functions, we look at the how that scope is created. For example, as a functional, when we define a function as a function declaration, and with block as well, when we define is a block inside of this, and all of this discussion or the truth of this scope, right? To understand where do we get here. So how do we get here is because the way how the observable behavior when we analyzing is the JavaScript for syntax errors, early errors in hoisting, and that's not mean in anything. Uh, so with hosting, which is a way of how now certain variables declarations are put at the top of the current scope and initialized with a value. So for variables declaration, it is initialized as undefined, and then as the statement is now associated the value, and the same for functions declarations. So the which is now put at the top of that scope and initialize with the function value, with the set of instructions of that. So there are also some implied scopes. So for example, like parameter scope, that's pretty mind bending when I look at that. And the other is the reasoning of using now formal functions declaration for the function name declaration, because unlike arrow function, which is another way of how you can describe functions as an expression, all right, because they are they are lexically anonymous, so you can reference in that lexically speaking, and you can create as a variables and held that in where you can describe a variable and held inside the function. This is a function expression, but not a function's definition, or a function's declaration. And there's some subtlety in there. But in any case, the point is that using now functions name parameter, which are lexically, so they have a name bound to that lexically, and also you can use now functions names as descriptor to, well, describe what's going on in your code, especially useful for this piping operations, whether it's synchronous operations using map, filter for, or any of these operations that you can work not only on arrays but also in on any collections, usually as array. And the other is the as dealing with eventual values. Okay, so for example, like promise or observables, and then you want to now apply is certain filter or transformations upon that data, right? This is part of the event programming. So but in any case, here with this description of the scope, all right, and also look at other places uh, that we can use a scope like the global scope, and why the reason of the global scope that act as a place where different single standalone files can interact with, all right. So usually in the browser context, we have the ES6 model, the way of how you can now make one particular file to collaborate with others at runtime by using the import keyword, and the UMD, which is a fancy way to say, hey, let's going to define certain variables that let's to enclose define certain variables where each variables are going to associate now some sort of instructions, aka function expressions, where inside of those instructions you define some behaviors. Let's say, hey, this is the model 1, or the model 2 held in another variable, or the model 3 held in another variable, and all of them are enclosing usually in a function scope, where inside of that you can now collaborate and work among different models, and then ship that to the browser as an immediately invoked function expression, right? So, and also is the global scope. So because this global scope that expose certain in or have that expose certain intrinsic values or methods that we can go on. So whether it is this JavaScript, that I would like to make a quick recap of that. For example, here it exposed now the JavaScript primitive, or the expose the JavaScript built-ins. So like primitive, native, global functions like eval, parse int, namespace like JSON, math, and some friend of JavaScript recently like internationalization and WebAssembly, as well as the environment hosting, the JavaScript engine exposed its own built-in. So, those environment built-in exposed by the engines are, for example, like the console, the DOM, the workers, or the web platforms as well, the navigator, the history. So, because so because these global scopes are specific to each one of those environments, whether it's a browser. Within the browser, you have is the global scope, like the window objects, and how you can use the window objects to access is, well, these built-in functions, as well as you can access is DOM elements that have IDs, all right. Another environment is the web workers, where unlike the browser, it doesn't have any global variables. If you want to point that out, it has now a variable called self, and not doesn't have access to the DOM, and it has access to some built-in host specific like navigator, right? And I would like to dive deep into the web workers, absolutely, or at least to create now an example of that. So, and the other is the developer tool console, all right. With respect to our discussion here about scope, such observables differing in behavior may include the behavior of the global scope, the hosting, all right, of how this actually works, and blocking scoping declaration and let content see chapter C when using outermost scope. Exactly. So now this environment, the developer tools, doesn't behave the same as the global, specifically for blocking declaration with let and cons. That is quite interesting. That is quite interesting. Uh, Another place is the ES6 models. So you can think of this like a, uh, like a function scope wrapping this file. All right, you don't have access to global variables. Instead, you have now a model global that you can have access is via the export keyword. All right, uh, and the other is the node. So with node, you have is now a global scope, but it's interesting because one of the node that catch JavaScript developer off guard is that node treats every single JavaScript file that it loads, including the main one. You start the node process with an ES mod with a model, whether it's an ES model or CommonJS. So the practical effect is that the top level of your node programs, they never actually is never actually the global scope. Because each one of those files are loaded as a model. Okay. So unlike in browser, now nodes say, hey, anytime that I'm gonna load this particular file, I'm gonna execute this file, it treats this as a models. It treats every single JavaScript file as a model, whether it's a CommonJS or a ES model, which is never actually the global scope. The way when it loaded a non-model files in the browser. As of the time of this writing, Node has recently added support to ES6 model, but additionally, Node has from its beginning support a model format called CommonJS that looks like this. And if you are defining its variable inside of that, the way you can access to that in that environment is via the model here, model export, and this is where all the variables are defined, all these identifiers are putting in. So before processing, Node effectively wraps such code in a function, so that var and function declaration are contained in wrapping function scope, not treated as global variable. Exactly. So they are wrapping in models or function scope in this case, not treated as global variables. And envision the preceding code as being seen by Node as this, illustrated, not actual. So you can think of this as a model that say, hey, I'm going to expose this in some in and when I call to this model, hey, I'm going to attach all of these variables as it is. Node then essentially invokes the added model functions to your run of your model. And you can clearly see why student name and hello identifiers are not global, but rather declared in the model scope. As noted earlier, Node defines a number of globals like require, but they are not actually identifiers in the global scope, nor property on the global objects. They are injected. Okay, so you can think that they are injected in the scope of every models. So essentially, every time that you now load that, every time that Nodes loads a JavaScript files, uh, it loads that as a model, whether it is as a CommonJS or an ES6 model, and then inject these globals variables. But it's because how it treats JavaScript files. So how do you define actual global variables in Node? Uh, That's a good question. So the only way to do so is to another on nodes automatically provided global, which ironically is called global. You have now global or global this. Global is a reference to the real global scope objects, somewhat like using window in a browser JavaScript environment. Here we add student as property to the global node scope that can be accessed through every single file that nodes loads it. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then you have now the global this, which is part of the review in this, right? So I'm mentioning is this particularly, right? Because as we explore the hosting, which is how now JavaScript behave where it look at certain functions declarations, whether it's var, functions, let cons respect to that particular scope in var and function declaration, as I mentioned before, it does what it does. And then some couple questions that come up. So for example, is that how now redeclarations of variables behave, how JavaScript treat this redeclaration of functions named declarations uh, in variables declarations. All right. So it turns out that in the case of functions declarations, uh, uh, well, it's going to now look at them, all right, and then it take the last declarations of that identifier with the same name, and then assign that value to that. So in other words, you might have some. So you might have, so for example, is something like this. So you might have something like this. What the French toast is this? So you might have something like this, right? And then somehow you rename this greeting here. And then you say greeting to Susie. All right. And you may wonder, well, what will be now is the value of that. It'll be now a function, okay? It'll work, or it'll be its var, right? Because in this case, you have now functions declarations and variables declarations, and both of them now are identifiers. And since here the last declaration of the same identifier is now var, and by default is initialized as undefined, greeting here, it will throw a type error or not. Let me see if I am correct. Interesting. It say no. So this, what it does, what it's saying is that functions identifiers and variables identifiers are treated separately. In other words, exactly, are treated separately. So you can get rid of this, right? So they are treated separately, right? So unlike you say something like this, and here's gonna, well, I do think it's because he already calculate that. Yeah, but if you do, for example, something like this, you refresh, it will give you now a type error. But for some reason now, if you say something like this, all right, my assumption is to say, hey, what is the greeting here with the function declaration and the function and the environment declaration? Well, is that because it have both the same name, the identifier will be now the last one, all right, or the value of this identifier that has been redeclared, it'll be now is the last one, which is what happening is gonna be undefined. Okay, yeah, because we hello there, but it turns out that this is not the case. All right, it turns out that now the functions declaration and the variable declarations behave different when it encounter is the name, when it have identified with the same name. And that is interesting. That actually break our intuition here. Okay, that actually break our intuition. And another thing is that if I do this, for example, exactly, it held that particularly value. But if in contrast I do this, it continues to held that because it doesn't clean that out. But is that again? This is the behavior of this, and this is a very interesting topic here that we're talking here, right? Exactly. So this is the question that we're asking and we're answering here, which is, hey, how now this variables, if the declarations appear past the first statements, how the reference, how will any reference, exactly, how will any reference before the declarations behave? Okay, and now here is this. So again, we look at that hosting happens for certain specific syntax, like function declarations, variables declarations, and also we're asking is another question is that what happened when you redeclare this? Okay, when you redeclare is the functions here or the variables here. So in other words, at least in this console, it treats now the greeting as a separate identifier here. So the compiler treating as a separate identifier when you have functions and variable declaration of the same name. However, if you, for example, do something like this, all right, as a function expression, all right, it will throw you an error because only functions and variables declarations are hosting. So not only that, variables declarations and functions declaration are hosting separately, despite that they have despite that they might have is the same name. And if for some reason you override that behavior, let's say hello, right? And then you want to try to call that, look at this, right? So it's gonna run that. And if you later on you say, hey, greeting of this function, exactly, because now you override this as it is. So this is a very careful scenario that I do find that, of course, most of the time that's not how we write our code. But again, this is part of the edge cases of this. And speaking of which, is also is that the reason of hosting. Why do we have hosting? So according to Carl Simpson, is that, well, because on hosting, we do want to organize our code by putting executable code first and then functions declarations last, and also is for variables declarations semantic convenience. So this is the case. This is why we might use, or the reason of why we use now hosting. And when you find that out in your code, that makes a lot of sense to do so, right? So speaking now is of what happened to these redeclarations of the variables is that, well, function expressions are not hoisted, okay? Uh, and understanding is the difference between the declarations and the function expressions. And function expressions are anything that produce a value, right? And here is describing is this single pass, but is this single pass is not as it is. So the best metaphor here that they're using is that there are certain declarations that are evaluated before runtime, right? That's more accurately that using all of these particular metaphors that now the that involved is on bucket and scope, in marble buckets and scope to actually illustrate that lexical scoping. But the reality is that there's certain declarations, syntax forms, right? That when you call it, or when now JavaScript engines look at that, it's going to first analyze them to determine it as a scope, and pass some early errors, and to determine its hoisting before the code is executed. This is a more accurate stuff here, because and I am here is for things that are accurate because it works. Period. Not for mental models, not for things that might work. No. It's for things that works. So this is it. They just, for example, Kyle Simpson here is mentioning is this particular metaphor, right? Where they say, hey, hosting. So this hosting metaphor is convenient. It is benefit. Is allowing us to hand weave over the magical look ahead pre-processing necessary to find all this declaration. Or the metaphor that is using here is this. The rule of hosting metaphor is that functions declarations are hosted first. It's like functions declaration are hosting first. Then variables are hosted immediately after all functions. Thus, the hosting story suggests that the program is rearranged by the JavaScript engines to look like this. So, and also now makes a lot of sense. So, function hosting are, or functions declarations are hosting first, and variables hosting here. If this is true, right? If this is true, of these functions declarations are hosting first and variables declarations later, right? If both of them have the same name and you somehow wants to call them, so for example, something like this, because we're talking about is the redeclaration of this. Say greeting, right? In this case, the value should be is now undefined. So it's supposed to throw me is okay. Hello there. It's supposed to throw me is like a type error. But it turns out that it's not, right? It turns out that it's not. So in other words, and if you put it here in this way, and I know that goes beyond the scope of today's video, but it's just to grasp your mind around this concept of hoisting, that this is certain functions that there are certain declarations that are hosted, that are put at the top of the scope. Function declaration behave in this way. All right, it's similar for var declarations. And uh, and when you have declaration with the same names, depend of the environment, at least on the developer tool, it say, hey, I have now internally JavaScript say, hey, I have now this identifier with the function, and I do have also another identifier with the variables. So if you for some reason do something like this and say hola qué tal, all right, so uh, if we follow this logic, like putting now in like in a stack, all right, so function greeting here is put at the first of the stack, then the var we have another stack and put it here there at this identifier, and then we have now this function declaration here and putting at the identifier. And when we call this initially, all right, so I'm assuming that it's gonna call the last function that was defined. In other words, hola que tal, and that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so internally, so now JavaScript is like holding is this particular stack, we're gonna put now this kind of stuff for variables declaration, and that makes a lot of sense. And how do you deal is with this this function declaration and function expressions, the declaration and expressions. Oh, okay. And that makes a lot of sense. So here it say this, all right, but it turns out that a good analogy of this, it turns out that a good analogy of this is that now the stack, okay. So a good analogy of this will be is like that. Again, this is because how this behaves in the dev console. But this is how it is behaved in this console. Mm-hmm. 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 That's a good question here to understand now truly how this actually works. It's not what should be, it's not what could be, it's what it is, man. Period. It's what it is. Okay. It's what it is. Mm-hmm. Of this. So the question is, how can I collaborate here? Pull request template. Okay, before submitting a PR, open an issue to ask about it. If you choose to contribute content, not just typo correction to this repo, you agree that you are giving me a non-exclusive license to use the content for the book. and I and my publishers deemed appropriate. You probably guessed that already, but I just wanted to be extra clear on that. Exactly. You're giving me a non-exclusive license to use the content from the book. Okay. So before submitting a PR, open an issue to ask about it. hmm Content question. Okay. Textual grammar typo. Blank issue. Type already searched for this issue. Ah, okay. Um, Not closure, but it's the um, hoisting. Function declaration hoisting. Hoisting function and var hoisting. Mm-hmm. Uh, Scope closures. Chapter 5. Exactly. Chapter 5 and redeclaration. Chapter 5 and hosting, yet another metaphor. My intuition was not right, but the observable behavior is like JavaScript compiler holds uh, reference holds identifier names reference which is reading undefined. But when I evaluate at the console, at the dev tool, it runs the function. So the observable behavior is like JavaScript compilers holds, is like the JavaScript compilers hold identifier names reference like an stack for functions in variables, okay, like a stack for functions and variables definition that match what you match the order in which you that match the order you describe in the hosting yet another metaphor last section. Functions definition first, exactly, functions definition are hosting or are evaluating first, which is this: function declarations are hosted first and then variables hosted immediately after all. So function definitions are hosted first, okay, it has more priority than variables definition. Exactly. So function definition are hosted first and has more priority than variables definitions. Okay. So when I create this, I say is hosting functions declaration in functions in variables declarations act as a stack, as a priority stack. All right. Okay, that's quite interesting. Absolutely, absolutely. To explore more about that, yes. And there you got it. So again, I'm exploring is this particular topic because to me it's just to once and for all know what hosting is doing, right? And especially when you redeclare them, functions and variables. So based on this observable reality, this work as it is. So okay, good, good. Makes a lot of sense. And now we're talking about is the redeclaration of that, right? Especially redeclarations of of variables with the same names of variables or that. But the spec says that var identifiers, no matter how many times you define them with the same name, all of them refers to the single variable. So for example, if you define here several times, it's actually is pointless here, right? Say Frank, you define here. So now this is actually is Frank. All of as unless you don't reassign this new value, is it is. All right. So similar to Frank, you can define this, and then you can define undefined. And here, because now an assignments happen, you of course override that, right? The same for greeting here, right? So var greeting here, and the type of is now a function here. That's interesting, which is a function, and the same for var greeting hello, and the type of greeting of string here, right? The first greeting declaration register the identifier to the scope, and because of it var, the auto initialize will be undefined. The function declaration doesn't need to register the identifier, but because of functions hosting, it overrides the auto initialization to use functions reference. The second var greeting by itself doesn't do anything since greeting is already an identifier and function hosting already took precedence to auto initialize it. Actually, assigning hello to the greeting changes its value from its initial functions for this. But again, this is because of this. The function declaration doesn't need to deregister the identifier. But because of function hosting, it overrides the auto initialization to use the function's reference here. Right? And the second here, var greeting by itself doesn't do anything since greeting is already an identifier of a function here, which is kind of weird here. Which is kind of weird. Is this supposed to be now undefined, not type of? So it's telling now that it has a preference here. It's telling now that this identifier has preference here. It's telling that this identifier is now has preference here. For example, this, hey, now this is a function. Why? This isn't supposed to be, well, at this point it is. It makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. So at this point, it makes a lot of sense, right? So when you run this, let me rerun this. So at this point, it makes a lot of sense. But it's interesting that this now, it's a, hey, this is now a function. So in other words, this is telling you that there is a preference, there is a priority here for identifiers that functions come first and then variables. And that now solves the mystery here. And that now solves the mystery here. Which is now an undefined. That's what is happening here. So JavaScript now it's a, hey, if I have the reference of the same name, and one of them is a reference of the variables, and the other is a reference of a function, I'm gonna give priority to the functions. This is why now first, okay, this is now why JavaScript treats or it says that functions are first class citizens here, and it's because it is analyzing stuff. Okay, so I do find that that is very, very revealing in terms of doing so. All right. So that's quite that's solve a particular mystery here, especially that. And the reason is that the reason of JavaScript of doing so is, well, because now it prefers functions declaration. It prefers to define the execution of the code first, and then the functions declaration last. So it makes sense to define this behavior as it is, and conveniently now use variables down there. Okay, that's mind bending. And now how let and var and cons will behave depend on loops. So here, with while and for, let behave as it is. In other words, it follows the distinction. You cannot redeclare here. In other words, it's creating a new scope here on any time. So this is now a new scope that's creating here. Makes sense. But it doesn't work for the for of with cons, because you are reassigning this. Because you are as reassigning is in this. And that'll be all for this video. I do find that that's quite interesting. Take care. Bye bye.